This video will cover the basics of what slides will be immediately available to students when they open your notebook for the first time. Remember, if there's any content that you want to give to the students beforehand, you need to make sure that that content is available and preloaded into the notebook that you have in your master copy before you make it an assignment. The most important thing for this is to take your time and start and stop when we look at the different formats. Finally, I will tell you that the next video is going to cover some more tips and tricks on how you can make it more doable to allow students to more easily update these notes over time. Today, we're going to be looking at the notebook from a student perspective, and I just chose math, and I'm using math with the adjusted pages. On our landing page, this is going to be known as the math template without lined pages. Now, the important thing to know is that this is going to be true for every single subject area. So the basics work for everybody, not just math. The first page in the notebook will have an editable front, just like a composition notebook, where the student can put their name, their class period, and hopefully they'll leave out editing their class name. But let's say that there's somebody who they really want to make sure that they know that they're in Algebra 1, then they can edit that. You also can edit this too if you want to make sure that students recognize that it's Algebra 1, or if you're a teacher who teaches teaches different sections of a class. If that helps you to remember when you are editing or adding things to your own notebook. The next page features Costas levels of questions. These are an Avid resource, and while this is set up with Avid students in mind, they also are best practices and questions for all students. These are based off of Bloom's levels of taxonomy, and so if you wanted to create a formative assessment by asking students to write a different level question and answer it for a test review or just as a brief formal assessment, then these questions are a resource that your students will immediately be able to have. The third page features important shortcuts. During our last bout of digital learning, a lot of teachers realized that not all of our students knew how to operate computers in terms of knowing proper shortcuts. So this was made up with the idea of how could we ensure that students would have access to those key shortcuts using a computer. And that's where this page comes in. So my suggestion is, if you don't want to keep the Costas level of questions, you can kick that from your initial draft that you use. But I would strongly suggest keeping the important shortcuts page, because that's going to make it possible for you to be able to ask students to refer to it if we have to go back to distance learning in the future. The next 3 slides are going to be the most important for a lot of you. It's going to be a unit title card, a Bellwork slide, and a note template that is not specialized and it's just for general notes purposes. So we are going to go more in depth in those. At the end of this video, there will be a focus on 2 other slide template formats that might help you out depending on what kind of notes you want your students to use. But the most important question that you need to consider is, what do I want to use this for? And how can I use what my students already have in order to be most effective? The 3 most important slides that you're going to probably be using in this notebook format are going to be this blue title slide for each unit, as well as a Bellwork section and a regular notes section. I'll talk about the other 3 components that are more specialized in a minute, in case that's what you want to work with. But first, let's say that we're in math and our unit is linear equations. The great news is our template is set up so that the students can actually type this in and you don't have to do any relabeling. So let's say our unit is Unit 1, linear equations. I know many of you have a system where students have to show their learning objectives and you give them a sheet to do so. The good news is we can create a space where students can do that on here. So first, after we have our main title, we can go to new slide, and the template is set to automatically replicate the slide before it. So we're once again on a title slide, but let's say that I know that my students already have the unit title, or they should, and I just want them to upload my paper that shows what they've learned objectively. Then I can go to insert, or rather they can go to insert, go to image, and then they can go to camera, and they can hold up what they've learned. They hit the yellow picture. And then I can hit insert. And then rather than have the title, they can blow that up. And this can allow me to see what it is they know and they haven't known. The other alternative to this, and this is one that I would probably recommend more, is if you know what your objectives are going to be, you can create a table. And in that table, you could actually write out ahead of time learning objective. And then fill it out to the way that it works best for you all. This way, you can keep track, and it's the exact same format as what you've had your students be doing on paper. One thing that you can also do is, if you want students to be able to take this later and make it editable, you could create the table, and instead of putting it into your notebook, you could create it as material and upload it, requiring the students to have to copy and paste the table from the materials section of your Google Classroom and upload it directly into your learning objective slides. So that's another option for you. The next slide is the bell work slide. So if you have a student who comes in and you want them to do bell work, they can either type in their responses or they could put it on paper, and then they could take a picture of their bell work. Now, one thing that you can also do is a second format that we set up is for an exit ticket. So if you know that all of your students, for example, have their work that day, you could have an exit ticket after the notes, and then they could have to turn in everything to you. Because remember, as we said in the first video on setting up, you should set this where it's an assignment where students can turn it in. That way, it's never lost. It also helps you have a clear demonstration of what the students have and have not been doing in class. If technology is an issue, then that's where you would need to work with your students on a paper basis to figure out how you would get the same information in. By it being in Google, we hopefully have set up an area where most students will be able to quickly be able to turn things in. So in order to change a bell work slide from bell work to an exit ticket, all a student would need to do is go new slide, then right click, go to apply layout. They can hit exit ticket, and that's all they need to do. The next slide that we need to go over, or the next format, is basic notes. So for example, since we're in math again and we're in our linear equations unit, let's say that this is our first note lecture and it's basics of linear equations. The way our format is set up is that there is a text box that has space for a student to put whatever they need in terms of information. Now, one thing that you will want to make sure that you cover with your students is that by default, the template is set to have everything be underlined. So for example, definition. And if it's easier for your student to not have lines, tell them to hit Control U. This will take the underlining off. So linear equation is, so that's just inserting what it needs to be. Now, what I really like about this format is that if your student is a visual learner and the definition just doesn't seem to really be going along with them, a student could, in theory, based off of your suggestion, go and look up in Google, or even you can go to insert image, search the web. I can type in linear equation. I can click that, go to insert. And now I have in my notes a visual example of what this looks like. So once I've finished typing, I can go down to here, and maybe the next term is y-intercept. If you know that your student is somebody that needs to be able to clearly find this information, then I would have them hit Control U again. And they can make as many different slides as necessary to fill this out. So this would be for a basic level of, If you want students to use a more advanced template, such as 2-column, 3-column, or Cornell notes, we will discuss that next. The next set of notes that we're going to go through might be a little bit more specialized than what you need for your classes. However, they are still options that if you have students that this would be helpful for, they're available to you. The first are 2-column notes that are set up where you can have, so let's say definitions, linear equations, and then you have students bullet point out what they need to know. If you use this format, my suggestion is teach your students how to be able to use the line tool and be able to block off and divide where a new definition begins and ends. I've also created a compare and contrast format. So if I go to apply layout, you'll see there's a compare and contrast, because I know that for some people, it's not always best to have 2 columns. The other good thing is that students can expand and shrink out if it's a compare and contrast. So you can have item 1 Item 2. So that's another option for your students. Next, we have 3-column notes. If you use the 3-column notes, one thing that you might want to be aware of is for this to make the most sense for your students, you're probably going to need to have them go into each column and space down a bit. And they need to make sure that they clearly have a title / purpose for each slide, for each column. This would be most useful probably for social studies, since I know that you focus a lot on 3-column notes as a potential option. So that's there for you. And finally, we have as an option our Cornell notes. So my personal suggestion, even as an Avid teacher where focus notes like this are the norm, if I'm doing this in Avid, which we will be, I'm going to be having students use this more of a summary slide rather than as a complete substitute for their notes. The reason for that is because it's going to be a lot easier for students to view this as more of a summary and end of learning experience rather than the total of their learning, because given the limited space, a student might think, oh, I filled out the box, so that's enough information that I need to fill out. On this slide also, you see where it says Q column. Q column means questions that students have that come from their notes. So for example, going back to the second slide, that is the levels of questions, you could require students to write out a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3 question that come from their learning. And then they have to answer those 3 questions and summarize what they've learned here in the summary section. I'm going to be putting together an entirely different video that addresses how to do that, because it's best practices for Avid, and also because it can help provide hopefully another resource for you in terms of how you can have students actually reflect on notes rather than have them just write it down and forget about them. So with that, that's going to conclude today's video. The next video is going to be some more advanced tips that you can use, including answering questions like, what do I do with my students that need accommodations in terms of having notes provided for them? And also, how can I transfer over slides that I want students to have if there's information that I need them to have either word for word or pictures that they need to have directly from me. So that'll be our next presentation. Thanks for your time.